Okay, so hello and welcome everybody to this webinar and this chat on behalf of the CIPR International Group. And today we're talking about influencing the sustainability movement and the role PR professionals have within that. So my name is Claire Benson. I'm Chartered PR and Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Marketing and also founder of SDG Changemakers. Now, as a global community, we're actually living through continuous overlapping crisis with long-lasting effects. And it's certainly well documented that public and private sector organisations who build that resilience find that they're able to better withstand shocks and bounce back better too. And resilience is often associated with driving sustainable, inclusive growth. So the purpose of clarity for this webinar, I just wanted to take a moment to define sustainability. And as many of us all know, it really does refer to the economic, social and environmental sustainable business practices. So thus adhering to human rights and not impacting on the planet. The reason I wanted to define that is that it'll help us focus on what we're going to chat about today. Now, as a result of what we've all been going through over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, and particularly due to COVID, sustainability is considered by many to be mainstream. But the question that we want to ask today is the PR industry actually helping or harming the sustainability movement and the goal of tracking the 17 global challenges during this very important decade of action. So joining me on this international Zoom, so I'm in New Zealand, are Sian Conway-Woods, founder of the Ethical Hour and Behavioural Marketing Agency, 181st Street, and also Nikki Hutchinson, founder of Larkhill PR, both whom are located in the UK. So thank you very much, both of you, for being here and agreeing to be part of this chat. So we're hoping for your sakes, everybody, that our chat will be wide-ranging and we attempt to look at all sorts of aspects around the role of PR and from a number of different perspectives, including our own experiences as well on how sustainability is communicated and its impact on understanding those sustainable development goals. So there's a little bit of background to why we came up with the topic. Some of you may have known that earlier this month, it was Stockholm plus 50, and it was also 30 years since Rio. Now, incidentally, that's 30 years since I started university too, which is a bit of a worry sometimes when I look in the mirror, but it was the time when I was introduced to sustainable development in my international relations class. And interestingly, I found when I was looking back through, there was a mid-1992 press report, and this was on the state of the world, and it was disturbingly entitled, "A Decaying Environment, a Divided World." Now, when we look at today, I'm not always sure what's actually changed. And back then, there was also the same conundrum around sustainable development. So how does the global south develop economically, and how does the global north continue to do so without further accelerating the ecological deterioration and in fact supporting regeneration so that future generations actually have a peaceful planet to live on? So if we fast forward 30 years, and the major environmental and societal goals, such as those laid out underneath the Convention of Biological Diversity, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement, the UN Framework Convention of the Climate Change, I can keep going. They're all clearly off track. And we are facing a triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution and waste. And this is due to centuries of resource-intensive and unsustainable patterns of production and consumption, which has led to today. And we still have a highly unequal and inequitable global economy. As Professor Johan Rockstone said at Stockholm plus 50, beginning of this month, this is the decade when things have to shift. We must bend the curve of emissions, the loss of biodiversity, and of all unsustainable loading of all materials caused by overproduction and consumption. So Sian, Nikki, let me bring you in, and I want to ask, how far have we actually come since Stockholm and Rio 50 and 30 years ago?
Nikki, shall I go jump in, or do you want to go first?
I will.
I think it's a really interesting question, and to kind of take that perspective back, because sustainability in some circles is being seen as a trend, and it's being seen as kind of the big new thing, and suddenly the finance industry are talking about it, and suddenly it's in all the papers and it's on the telly and it's being talked about. But actually this conversation has been going on for a long time, and progress has been made, but it is a journey, and we're learning more and more every day about how our world works, what our relationship is with nature. We've the idea of a pandemic had been theoretical and been something that would happen, and the scientists have predicted it, and then it did happen and we all lived it. And actually that shifted our behavior, it shifted our mindset. And I think we're going through that every day with climate. And as the climate kind of changes and as things shift and we see these threats actually become reality in a lot of places around the world, we're starting to adapt and learn. And there's a debate to be had about how quickly we're doing that and whether it's quick enough. But actually I think we're constantly making progress on this in terms of the actions that we're taking, and also our understanding and our education.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Sian. I think the clock is ticking on climate change, and I think that's given us a bit of a push to actually really think about it seriously. It's been something that's been discussed for a long time, but given world events like the fires in California, people can actually see what's happening. And I do think sometimes consumer behavioural change comes from actually the evidence there and saying, look, we've been talking about this for a long time, but now you can actually physically see what is happening: floods, famine. God, I sound like the voice of doom here, but it's the reality, fires, floods and famine, and you can see what's actually happening. And I do think that is going to start resonating. It's resonating more with people, and it is and even the growth of things like B Corp as well, certification in B Corp companies is really showing that it has changed, but it feels like over the last couple of years, like you said, Claire, that almost the pandemic has given us that push we needed for it to bring it more to the forefront, so to speak.
Absolutely. And it's 50 years on since Stockholm, 30 years on since Rio. There's actually been a little sort of facts for you. There's actually been 500 multilateral agreements, 27 COP climate summits, 15 COP biodiversity summits, and 3 overarching Earth summits. So that's really interesting that so much has been going on and taking place over these years. And you're absolutely right. In many ways, we have to see what's going on in front of our eyes for us to perhaps really understand and believe and want to take that action going forward. So we're talking about the role of PR, and I'm going to ask a very controversial question. With regards to the fact it is 50 years on, and the fact that we have made progress, so we've managed to rebuild portions of the ozone layer, we've managed to grow the number of national environmental laws, the adoption of policies and actions on reducing air pollution. But do you think, if you think about the role that the PR industry has actually had to play, and the fact that we haven't perhaps come as far as we might have wanted to from 50, 30 years ago, do you think PR has had a role in this failure, considering the way that we work with corporates, the way we work with governments? Give me your thoughts on that.
Yes.
Sian, let me start.
Okay. I think we can't deny the fact, look at the concept of carbon footprint, right? That was developed by a PR agency for a big oil company to push the idea of individual action back onto consumers and stop them from challenging the bigger structural changes. So you can't deny that as an industry, and as professionals in that industry, many of us have greenwashed and engaged in that, and our industry has a history of that. But at the same time, coming back to that point about sustainability being a journey, the progress that has been made in that time, and the understanding and the education, the thing that's really interesting for me is the best people to tackle greenwashing are the people that understand from the inside how it works. So yes, we maybe have had a role in the damage, but everybody has, you know, corporations have, as consumers we have, and once we know better, we do better, right? So we can take all the learnings from the greenwashing that has happened, and actually you can't do ethical and sustainable PR unless the company you are PRing is ethical and sustainable. So it has to be baked into how that company operates, otherwise it is just surface level box ticking exercises, greenwashing. And actually I personally believe that the communications teams in organizations or agencies working with their clients are the biggest agents for change, because we are the ones that have the outside intelligence coming in, and we can say, this is what audiences want, this is what's going on in the industry, this is how to keep up, this is how to get ahead. We're the ones really up to speed with that. So although we might not have the really specialist knowledge to go and embed sustainability in that supply chain, we can say which areas they should be focusing on that's going to get a return on investment, and we can inspire that change to happen in alignment with all of the business goals, because actually we're the ones that understand that. So yes, we have played a part in the harm, but yes, we are playing a really big part in the transition to a more sustainable economy too.
Thanks.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Sian said, but and I think also we're perfectly positioned now to talk to companies about what the damage they're doing with greenwashing. So if you look, you know, consumers are more aligned or more alert to performative statements. We're seeing it a lot around not just sustainability, but statements that are being made, for example, around Black Lives Matters, around, you know, security of safety of women, everything like that. You know, consumers are aligned with, they're awake to performative statements that brands are making. And we're, you know, I think there was some I think it was Insights Consulting, they did a conscious consumption study, and they pointed out that brand trust and sustainability are vital. You know, sustainability is basically vital for brand trust, and it's something like only 41% of consumers trust brands that make sustainability claims. You know, that's 41%, you know. I mean, that's still a high number, but and that's where we're there. We need to be advising companies on the claims that they're making, you know, making sure it is baked in. Sustainability shouldn't be a performative statement to sell product. It should be something that's baked into your baked into everything that you do. And, you know, I think we spoke before, Sian, about, you know, you look at crisis management, not everyone's perfect. You know, there's companies, well-established companies that have got a long way to go, but don't claim that you're sustainable just to hit the headlines of being sustainable. You know, it's fine to put your hands up and go, you know, in the past we haven't been sustainable, but we're doing better. We know we have a role to play in society to make the world, to make our products more sustainable and make the world more sustainable. And I think that's really important. That's the role that comms teams play, whether it's in-house or agency, is to basically hold us to account about what we're saying and whether we're being, you know, it all goes down to authenticity, trust, honesty. That's what consumers want to hear from us. They don't want a performative statement and then find out later that actually what you were saying was completely wrong. So
no, absolutely, you know, and it's really interesting, you know, the study of sustainable business models themselves. You know, through our consultancy, we've been looking heavily at sustainable business models, and there's actually 45 patterns out there, you know, so there isn't one fits all either, which I think is really interesting. And so you're absolutely right. And I think somebody made the comment before about sustainability. No one can be 100% sustainable. You know, it's very, very, very difficult. And I think you both made the comment too, that it is a journey moving forward, which therefore brings me smartly and neatly to the rise of greenwashing. So in business, corporate responsibility has shifted to talking about overall corporate sustainability. So do you think sustainability has become a marketing tool, and perhaps now a rather empty word? Nikki, I'll let you go.
I think in some ways it has. We've done a bit of damage, for example, using it as a communication tool. I mean, probably one of the best examples was National Rail's temporary green logo, which got a lot of backlash from consumers as greenification. And I think that's a bit of... So I think people are not stupid and they see through it, and we need to make sure that as communications professionals that we're looking at what we're doing and the campaigns that we are doing to make sure that that we're not greenwashing, and that what we're doing, I think Sian covered it before, we just need to make sure it's authentic and transparent. Any of the campaigns that we're suggesting to clients or communications, that it's fully transparent and authentic, because we do more damage than good then.
Absolutely.
I think it's our professional duty in this space to question when we use sustainability as a selling point as well, because actually it is not the primary motivator for most consumers. When you look at that data around them not trusting brands and things, they expect it. Should be business as usual. And actually that's where we want to get to as sustainability professionals. We want every business to be as ethical and sustainable as they possibly can be. And at that point, it stops being a unique selling point. So for the majority of brands at the moment, they shouldn't actually be using it as a unique selling point, because it's not creating behavior change. It's not converting customers audience into customers. It's not creating those sales. And actually it is doing a disservice, because everybody's talking about it, but just creating more noise. There are obviously certain industries that are so bad that it is a selling point by saying, you know, we've got this certification and we're doing this and we're doing this differently. But over time, and I've always said this, you know, I've worked in the sustainability space solidly for 10 years. And I've said from the beginning, this will not be a selling point forever. So if you are starting a sustainable brand, you need to make sure that you have other selling points, because this is not going to be your unique selling point. And you shouldn't want it to be. You should want it to be business as usual. So I think we have to really carefully play that role, not just in questioning when somebody comes to us, you know, as an agency or in-house and says, this is sustainable because of this, can you go and push it? Not just checking that actually the evidence is there to support that sustainability claim, but should we even be pushing that in the first place? Because is it going to get business results? And is it doing any value for the overall sustainability conversation if I go and push this message out?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And we talked a little bit before about intent versus action as well, you know, and we've talked about research, and, you know, there's plenty of research out there. You know, Deloitte did a study in 2021 saying 32% of people engage with more sustainable lifestyle. Then there's other studies like the Economic Intelligence Unit said the 71% rise in popularity of searches around sustainable goods. But then when you look at action, certainly with sort of sustainable travel, a recent Wavemaker and YouGov did a recent survey, which was something like, I think it was something like 6% of people will actually change their travel habits. So, you know, in one way you're getting data that's telling you 71% of people want to be more sustainable, but when it comes down to it, the actual action and consumer behavior, only 6 people are changing their travel arrangements to be more sustainable. And, you know, there's a lot of, and we've discussed it before, there's a lot of reasons behind that, whether it's convenience and cost, and, you know, the thought of, you know, are you really going to try and get to New Zealand for a holiday for 2 weeks on a boat? You know, the age of the, you know, of that has, you know, so I think it is a really interesting, like, how do you, and I know, Sian, we've talked about consumer behavior and behavior change, and, you know, how do you change consumer behavior for some of the sort of larger ticket items, or things like travel, and, you know, the same with electronic vehicles. It's an interesting discussion, really.
That attitude behavior gap exists in every industry as well, and it's a really interesting one, because I actually believe, looking at it from a behavioral perspective, I believe that the questions to get to that data are wrong. Because if you ask somebody about, let's take fashion, for example, nobody wants to think that an item of clothing that you're wearing right now was made by a child, or was made by somebody in a dangerous factory, or has caused a lot of pollution. But the chances are it probably has, just thinking about global supply chains and where we all shop, that has probably been somewhere in the supply chain for one of the garments that you're wearing, at least right now. But if I asked you in a survey, would you pay more to make sure that that garment wasn't made by a child, you would absolutely say yes. but we then don't do, for a multitude of reasons. We're time poor, convenience, we're overwhelmed, everything else. We don't do the research to make sure that we are buying that. We just expect the brands not to use child labor or unethical conditions or, you know, toxic chemicals in their supply chain. Again, we expect it to be baked in. We don't feel like the responsibility should be on us as consumers. And I fundamentally agree with that, but that's where that attitude behavior gap comes in. And actually, to close that, we need to look at, as communications professionals, we need to start thinking about communications holistically and stop seeing advertising over there, marketing over there, and PR over there. Actually, it's a holistic approach to changing behaviors in the company and in the buying behavior. And actually 90% of our buying behavior is subconscious. So it's a losing battle to go out as a sustainable fashion brand, for example, and try and change hearts and minds around the sustainability of how we're buying fashion. It's a whole system change that we need to achieve. And actually we need to really think about the role of communications internally and externally, and stop seeing them as separate departments and separate roles. If we're actually going to shift and close that attitude behavior gap, it needs to be a holistic effort across the communications industry.
I completely agree. And I think you know, we were talking before about Love Island and product placement and influencers, and the way, you know, Love Island has changed from using a fast fashion brand to, you know, provide the contestants with clothing, to using pre-loved and using eBay, which you know, that is a really interesting shift, and it goes beyond PR, comms and marketing, because they've been able to use that shift and, you know, develop a campaign around it that does hit, you know, they've got a really great target audience there that actually are really sort of advocates of sustainability and the circular economy. But we talked about before about how eBay as a brand, you know, it's always had that credentials, but there's always been like people like Vinted coming in and Depop, but they've really sort of owned it and moved into a sort of potentially a newer target audience for them, which I think that's a really interesting and a really, really smart and clever move by eBay.
Yeah, and I think eBay are really achieving that segmented approach to changing that behavior, because actually there's multitude of different reasons for using eBay. And if you think about when they very first started, their messaging was all about saving money, you know, buying secondhand is cheaper. They really pushed that, and they really tapped into audiences where that really matters. Then they kind of moved on to the convenience side of it and things like, you know, it was massive before Facebook Marketplace. It was massive for new mums, where you churn through lots and lots of baby stuff and baby clothes very quickly. I've just been on that journey myself, and you do use these platforms and you pass things on and you sell it. And then they kind of moved into the collector's space, and you know, people that are into vintage cars and restoring cars, or into interiors, and they've got a big home section now, and you know, into those kind of specialist interest areas. And now they're positioning it as, well, we've always been sustainable, because secondhand is one of the most, you know, short of not buying anything, buying secondhand is actually the most sustainable option if you look at the hierarchy of needs. So actually that is really clever positioning on their part of something that is already baked in and they've already been doing. And what that achieves is it closes that attitude behavior gap, because somebody watching Love Island may have bought stuff on eBay because it's a designer handbag and actually it was cheaper to get it secondhand, or it's a collector's item of fashion that, you know, they bought, but then they go, oh, well, I'm already doing sustainability. It doesn't feel like this massive mountain they have to climb. It's behavior they're already doing. So I think in terms of that attitude behavior gap, that's really clever positioning, and obviously taking it into a mainstream audience, because isn't it the most watched program over the summer? Like the viewership on it is absolutely massive, and then the social reach that it gets as well, because it's got that cross-platform viral sort of you know, capacity to it. It's really, really clever positioning from them.
And also it's almost gaining their positioning back, because I know sort of Depop was always positioned as the eBay for sort of second-hand vintage clothing, and now eBay's sort of like captured that back, going, no, we're the eBay for eBay, you know, we are. But it's interesting how that's also had an effect on media placement. So for example, Vinted, which is obviously another another kind of place where people go to get vintage clothing, or, you know, their adverts are all sell the clothes you don't want and make some money. But they've now it's either sponsored or ads on video on demand around Made in Chelsea, another kind of program which probably has the same sort of age demographic as Love Island. I don't have that data to hand, but they're sort of like thinking, well, if they've got Love Island, we need to go with you know, Made in Chelsea and see you know, capture that audience there. So it's interesting, and it'll be interesting to see how it does. I mean, you were talking, I think, did you say, Sean, before that there was an increase in searches for sustainable
pre-loved fashion searches have gone up, I think, by about 300% since the first episode of Love Island aired on Monday. And like you said, it's that ripple effect, because it establishes a new category norm. There's a reason why all the lager brands sponsor football, you know, that's a category norm. And actually it then just becomes the standard, and it stops being something that people pay attention to because they just expect it. But which isn't great from an advertising and cut-through perspective, but is actually great from a behavior change perspective, because if suddenly all of these programs start being sponsored by pre-loved fashion platforms rather than fast fashion brands, that will then become the norm of course I'm going to buy one bikini and wear that multiple times, rather than, you know, a £1 bikini or whatever it was from Misguided last summer as part of the Love Island push. So it's really good for establishing that new normal, and that's what we need to get to.
Yeah, and selling on, you know, selling the clothes that you maybe have worn once or twice on. And I think Depop did some research way back, I think it was about 2018, 2019 on that, looking at the circular economy, and, you know, people may be buying from fast fashion, even a top from Primark, but then those are being sold on. So, you know, it's building that sustainable circular economy for fast fashion as well. So ensuring that, you know, you may wear an outfit once. I mean, I don't have enough I don't have enough imagination to do that, but being able to do that, I think, is really good, and making it a more of a norm. And I think it's really important, an interesting move, but good.
Excellent. So that's emanated from our discussion around sort of greenwashing, and I want to switch that tag around actually and ask the question about, do you think the tag of greenwashing has actually led to a degree of corporate shaming, celebrity shaming, individual shaming? And do you think that fear has led to a culture of fear within the business community, actually, to want to authentically report on positive and negative impacts on their business, and consequently the role that PR has there?
Yeah,
greenwashing. Go on, Nikki.
I was saying yes, I think shaming has. I mean, we were talking before about celebrity shaming, you know, specifically the royals have been shamed quite a bit in the media. And it's not necessarily the role of, I'm not talking about the role of PR, but the role in media in shaming. So, and the message that kind of sends to consumers. So, you know, we've all seen just recently, I mean, poor Meghan and Harry, you know, they seem to get it in the neck quite a bit by the press. The most recent from the Red Tops was, yeah, they talk about environmental, but then they've flown back on a private jet back to the States, or they do a lot of travel. And that kind of sort of damage that does to the consumer mindset of, oh, why should we be cutting down our travel and be more sustainable when, you know, oh, is it the privileged can talk about what they're doing and from a tell us to be more sustainable, but then their actions are not suggesting that they're more sustainable, when you're not looking at the holistic approach. But I think kind of there's a role in the media and of being a little bit more less shaming. We like to shame and blame, and but I think there's a role we have of taking those conversations and making them, you know, from a corporate perspective, making it like, you know, it isn't about that. And, you know, you're not seeing the whole picture, so to speak.
Yeah.
I think the greenwashing kind of concept is one we have to be so hot on, because it's so subjective, and because it is that journey, and there isn't a set, you know, we're getting the Green Claims Code and things like that, but there isn't a set framework of what is and isn't greenwashing. And actually where a lot of brands come unstuck with this is that they start off as challenger brands and they come out of the gate as we're really ethical and sustainable, we're values led, and they attract that low hanging fruit of really values driven audiences. And then as they grow, those audiences typically don't see themselves as fitting into the mainstream. They see themselves as very different, and they see themselves as really passionate and well informed, and they will then be the ones that have a big emotional reaction and almost turn on you. And the really kind of classic example of this was Oatly. Obviously came out of the gate as, you know, we're an alt milk and we're taking on the dairy industry and we're this challenger brand, got investment, became a big corporate, and are now finding that that initial audience of early eco adopters is really turning on them because they just fundamentally don't agree with that growth and with the shifts that have had to happen for that to go more mainstream. And it's a really difficult one because those core eco audiences say they're all for it going mainstream and they want everyone to act like it, but they very quickly can become the ethical and sustainable police. And it's because they've built that really emotional connection with these brands, because they don't see themselves as fitting in the mainstream. They then, when a brand comes along that does resonate with them, they really kind of latch onto that emotionally, and then they do have that backlash. So I think we have to be really careful, because it's not seen holistically, is it? And we talked about this before with the royals and the private jet thing. You know, it's always picked up on, isn't it? A politician gets on a private jet or a member of the royal family, but it is a security risk to put them on a mainstream commercial flight, and I personally would not want to be on that flight. That is a risky flight to be on. So you know, it's really important that we see it holistically, but the average consumer just sees that and goes, oh well, you know, I've really been trying, but I still am going to get on a plane on my holiday, and everyone's going to judge me and shame me, and why should I get involved then if it's not going to be a welcoming space where we support that? So I think if you're a very conscious consumer, I think you always have to kind of check that reaction that you're having to that when you're starting to call out greenwashing. And as a brand, I think you have to think about what emotional reaction are our consumers going to have, and plan that in when you're launching campaigns and you're thinking about the pushes you're going to do. How is that sustainability shame going to play a role in this campaign, and how are we going to counteract that? And it should be part of your crisis planning, actually, because the way that you react to that sustainability shaming sends a really strong message about whether or not you are an inclusive brand and other people can come at any stage of their journey and start to be more sustainable with you. And I think, again, it's one that everybody's got a role to play, and everybody should kind of consciously be thinking about at the planning stage of campaigns.
No,
yeah.
really,
And I mean,
really
I suppose that kind of resonates with, because some of the smaller challenger brands often get bought up, certainly if in the food and drink industry, could get bought up by a big holding company like someone like Unilever or someone like that. And, you know, then it's the communication, then you may lose consumers, because, you know, they maybe look at kind of the bigger holding company and look at their sort of like sustainability credentials. But in some ways, as a consumer, you need to allow them and allow those companies to grow and become, you know, then not all, because I think it's there was a brilliant article by John Brown from Don't Cry Wolf. He wrote a fantastic blog about B Corp and B Corp shaming bigger brands like Nespresso and Evian and people who wanted to join the B Corp movement. But to make that change, everybody has to be involved. You need to invite everyone to the table, and they may be on a different, like you were talking, Sean, about journey. Some of the big challenger brands are on a different journey because they've got to kind of almost change the way they are to becoming more sustainable, whereas some challenger brands are sustainable and then they're having to adapt to a bigger corporate sort of environment. So, you know, only by having everybody around the table and that diversity of, not just diversity of thought, diversity of different people on different journeys, can you really become more sustainable. And you can't, it's like going, oh well, you know, you're not part of our group, but they want to make change. So I think it's been more open with people, and, you know, inviting everyone around the table and understanding that it's going to be different, and for different companies, I think is really, really important, and understanding that in the communications as well. And you talked about crisis communications. I mean, crisis is about being authentic and being honest and transparent in what you've done, and being honest about, maybe we haven't been sustainable. We're looking at that at the moment and we're trying to change. We're not going to greenwash and say, oh yeah, now we're sustainable. But by saying we've got a long way to go, but we're on that journey, and we want to be more sustainable, and bringing consumers with you is better than sort of greenwashing, unless you will get shamed.
Absolutely. And I think the final point I'll put there as well is that, when we think about some of the impact reports, and particularly around ESG reporting, sometimes the corporates are reporting on the more positive elements of ESG and missing out on the negative side. And I think it's really important that there is that balance, because on the flip side, if it's all positive or looking sort of is going in the right direction, it's also not giving the true picture of where we are on our collective sustainability journey either, which I think is really important that we always keep that in mind. So leading on from there and touching on to ESG is the really interesting one for me is around financial communications. So most in the sustainable world would agree that there's an absolute desperate need to transform economic and financial systems. So from your own perspectives, do you think the financial commentators and writers are actually doing enough to instigate this change? Sian?
I think this is a really interesting one, because we do a lot of investor relations communications as an agency, and what we're finding is that really kind of brought in brands that are baking in sustainability and then saying, we want to find investors that really align with our values, that understand our timelines, understand that our business model might be fundamentally different, and then that becomes a challenge for them, and that becomes the communications challenge. And again, I think in mainstream financial commentary, we're just finding it still being a bit of a tick box exercise. And that's where a lot of the criticism of ESG is coming from. And actually, ESG is just another way of reframing sustainability. And it is that if you do it right, there is that depth to it, because Claire, you said at the beginning, sustainability isn't just planting some trees, it's your human rights policies, it's your governance, it's everything. And actually ESG, I think, is a good framework for widening that out and stopping people just thinking environmental when they think sustainability. But actually ESG covers things like, are you GDPR compliant? Are you handling your data ethically? Are you selling in an ethical way if you're doing it right? But I think a lot of the commentary, and again, it comes back to what we were saying about the media and the royals and their private jets, it's just to sell papers and to get attention. And we're living in that world of 3-second attention spans. To get people to engage, it has to be at a surface level. And I think, again, what we need is system change within the financial industry to really understand how this bakes in and how it works. And that is only going to come from that dialogue of these brands that are going for investment, going and talking to the investors about how their business model works, presenting that opportunity, and the investors starting that learning process and doing it together and having that conversation. And that's fundamentally why it's a communications challenge, and it's something that we should be engaging in.
I completely agree with you. And it's also reporting on ESG as well. So we discussed before, in a conversation we had before, you've probably seen the news around the head of Stagecoach in Germany has had to step down because part of DWS, but their failure to report, their misreporting of their ESG, of sort of where they were with ESG. I think it was to do with ESG assets. I'm not fully informed in exactly what it was, but that goes to the way those annual reports are public, and people are seeing that and saying, well, do they understand how they should be reporting back on ESG? So that's really, really important as well. And that's part of, I suppose, financial comms, understanding when they're reading through the annual reports, making sure that they're there is a good understanding of what should be in those reports. And is it, are we just doing a tick box exercise going, oh, ESG, we've got to cover that, or that's a tick box exercise, or we are actually looking at it and going, oh, is what we're reporting truthful? And you hope you hope it would be. And I'm not a financial comms expert, so it'd be interesting to get sort of perspective from someone who was sort of in that sort of space as well.
I think that's the most positive thing for me, is that it has now found a place in those reports, because actually your financial reporting is regulated. So you have to do it in a certain way. And I think while we've been using sustainability and ESG as a selling point and as a marketing, and, you know, advertising standards are there, but they're woolly, and they recognize that. That's why they've developed the Green Claims Code. It's why they're moving, and, you know, they've got a task force working on that now. They're moving in the right direction, but that will be slow. The Green Claims Code only is existing legislation, so they've pulled out bits of trading standards and made that apply to sustainability, because they recognize that creating new legislation is going to be a lengthy process. So that's kind of stopgap, and that will get there. But all of that regulation already applies in the financial industry in a much stricter way. So actually, now that companies have to report it in their financial statements and in their reports to their investors and their shareholders and everybody else, that comes under that regulation. And we can then see the mismatch. If they're saying one thing in their financial reports that have to be open and transparent and regulated, and then they present a different marketing message. So that's actually a really strong way of creating that change as well. And I think fundamentally, all of this needs regulation, and I really do believe that. And I think, you know, there's a place for things like B Corp, but I just think actually that is the stopgap to regulation. And you've got companies like, and the Nespresso thing is really interesting, because obviously that's one area where they have tried to be a bit better, but fundamentally there are massive flaws with Nestle as a company. And that, for me, that is a reputation risk for any B Corp, because there are fundamental flaws with the certification, that you can get certified when you have a holding company or a parent company that has got those fundamental flaws. And actually the debate there and everything else, all of the conversations that happen around that, the solution to all of that is regulation, because Nestle as a whole company are not going to change until they are legally forced to, and they've come out and said that in their statements. And, you know, other companies as well, I'm just picking on them because we use them as an example, there's lots of other companies as well. So these certification and things are a good stopgap, but actually the regulation is what will create the change. And we're seeing that happen in cases like this, where actually a CEO has had to stand down because they've misreported their ESG. That has come from financial regulation, not from advertising or competitions regulation. So it's interesting how the different pieces are starting to fit together to make this a more controlled environment, where you actually have to be doing what you say you're doing.
Yeah, no. Who's policing it, basically? Who's policing the certifications? And that is where, like, you're right, that's where regulation comes in, because it just, you know, there's so many people are doing so much good with B Corp. However, there will be a couple of people who, you know, it just takes that one story to get out, and it kind of damages that certification. You know, it's like you can't do it, and you've got to invite everybody in, but equally there has to be a standard and a regulation around that standard, to make sure that people are not just ticking a box or just filling in a form and say, oh yeah, I've been now certified, you know, going back and making sure that they're continuously their behavior is what they've said they're going to do. I think is really, really important. But I think B Corp is really good, and I think it's something that it might be a stopgap, but maybe it is pushing the industry a bit more forward and getting people to think. So I think it is important.
I think it helps create that awareness, and it also starts to create those standards to say what a regulatory framework could look like. And I think that's where it plays a really important role. And actually, it's really important, I think, with a lot of small businesses achieving it, it's really important to show that it can be done. But I do struggle with cross-industry certifications, because I just think there's so many nuances that there's always going to be areas where it falls through the gap. And I think it's right for some businesses, it's not right for others. But if you make that judgment that it is right for you, you do need to factor into your crisis communications what happens if there's a BrewDog or if there's an espresso. Because actually, if we've made us being a B Corp a fundamental part of our messaging and our marketing push and everything else, because that is right for us and we score really highly, and that's the framework we're using, what happens if that certification falls into disrepute or something happens happens to that then creates a reputational risk for us. So I think it's just part of your strategic planning as a whole. And, you know, there's never going to be one certification that's right for everybody, but they create a really good framework for what legislation could look like. And at the end of the day, that's what we need to give, because the people that create legislation are not always experts in the area they're creating legislation in. So they look to industry. That's why they have consultations. And actually what it does is create a voice and create kind of everybody on the same hymn sheet to then report back and say, this is what this should look like and this is what we need it to do. So I think it's really important to weigh up whether that's right for your business or not. And then it's really important to think, how do we take that a step further and contribute to lobbying, contribute to consultations, make our voice heard at that bigger level, so that there is not a reputation risk. Because we can say, when there is a brewdog situation, we can say, you know, that's actually fundamentally against the principles of this certification, and there's accountability there. And I think it's creating that cross-industry accountability is really, really important.
Yeah, totally agree.
Excellent. No, that's really good discussion. I'm sorry I disappeared halfway through that. I'm back again. So as we are coming to a close, but the last area that I wanted to touch on and discuss a little bit was the role of influencers. So the environmental concerns are obviously increasingly growing, particularly around young consumers. So in your own mind, how do you think influencers are influencing sustainability story, but also getting to the point that, as you've both alluded to, it actually is coming down to transitioning to sustainable business models, tacking on standards, tacking on activities is never going to be how we're going to achieve transformational change. We actually have to transform businesses from within. So how do you think the role of influencers plays out in the story of sustainability in our collective journey? Nikki.
I think with anything with influencers across the board, it's about their credibility, whether they can be a trusted source and have the expertise. So, you know, someone like David Attenborough is an influencer who's credible. Whereas when companies start using, potentially, you know, we're talking about Love Island, if they start using a specific influencer with eBay, they're going to have to make sure that that person, they're a brand, they're like a company. Those influencers need to also make sure that they're being authentic and they're trustworthy, and, you know, they are living the sustainable, you know, like you said, no one's 100%, but you need to make sure those influencers that we can't turn down the line and go, oh yeah, you know, 1 minute this influencer is discussing about they're using eBay, and the next minute they're off working with a fast fashion brand as well. So I think it has to be the right influencer, and it has to be an influencer that really does live and is credible, lives the sustainable brand, and is credible, trustworthy, has the expertise, and actually is authentic at the end of the day. Because I think it can do more damage than good, having an influencer. It's like everything. Those influencers, it's the same that's happening in mental health as well. We're seeing a growth of mental health influencers, and actually they can do more damage than good, making suggestions, or that's my thing. They just have to be authentic and live the brand if they're going to really influence.
I completely agree. And I think, again, that needs to be part of your risk assessment when you're going in.
Yeah.
And you've got to think audience first with influencers, and who is going to resonate most with your audience, and then what are the risks. But you need to also think about your other audiences, because if you have got a really core sustainability following, and then you work with someone who's at the early stages of their journey, you might get called out and sustainability shamed for that, and say, well, that influencer is trying to greenwash by working with you. So you have to really think holistically about the story you're going to tell of that influencer's journey and that partnership. And the advice I'm giving to a lot of my clients around their influencer partnerships is actually to shift how they see them, to obviously go micro influencers rather than macro influencers, so you can tell several different stories to several different audiences, but actually think long-term partnerships. Because if you look at all the data around influencer marketing, actually the level of trust, it's similar to what you were saying before, Nikki, about brands trusting, people trusting brand sustainability claims. Actually, influencers are not as influential as we often think. And when it comes to sustainability, there's some really good data about who people trust, and it is friends and family and academics. So again, is an influencer campaign right for you, or is a social proof and word of mouth campaign going to be better? If an influencer campaign is going to be right, I think you need to approach it the way we used to approach advertising and print media, that actually you need to be in that glossy magazine in that same position for 6 to 8 months before that ad is going to get any cut through, because you need that recognition. I think it's the same with influencers these days, because of the way the algorithms work and everything else. Those partnerships need to be long-term, structured partnerships that tell a story and take people on that journey over a period of time. Just getting an influencer to wear your organic cotton dress today and then do a H&M haul tomorrow is not going to work. It's that authenticity, like you said, Nikki. I completely agree.
Authenticity and credibility. You know, you can only get credibility if you're trusted and have the expertise, and that goes down to, you know, academics and trust element as well. I completely totally agree with you, that it just has to be around credibility and audience,
and it's
and
interesting.
also,
I was just going to say, it's interesting that the influencer partnerships do fall under the Green Claims Code, and actually the Advertising Standards Agency and Competitions Markets Authority and all the people driving this regulation are also looking at influencers. So you really have to think carefully about your partnerships and how that's going to affect you from a legal standpoint as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's been a fantastic discussion. Fantastic chat points have come out. I've really enjoyed that myself. I hope everybody else who's joined us on the call have enjoyed it too. I think ultimately, within the PR industry, it's getting back to our basics of strategy. It's getting back to making sure that we understand our research. It's making sure that we understand our audiences and making sure that we've got a clear, concise and simple message going back out. So thank you very much for joining us all today, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.